Welcome to the stage, Loe Lee.
Awesome. I think we're just waiting for it to come up. Awesome. So hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Dash, for inviting me. My name is Loe Lee, and I'm an art director and illustrator in New York City. Today I'm going to talk about a question that I often get about some of my illustration projects, and that's, how'd you get that gig? This is going to be a Once Clueless Freelancer's Guide to Commercial Illustration. So I'm going to be walking through the process of booking and executing commercial illustration projects. And even if you're a more seasoned artist or you just want to do some freelancing on the side, hopefully I have some tips for you in order to expand your client base. Okay, so I have an agenda, so you kind of know when is this going to end? Well, here you'll have like an agenda of what we're going to go through. So I'm going to go a little bit about myself. A little bit of background, so how I got my foot in the door. I'm going to go through my process from beginning to end via the case study of a very specific project. Then I'm going to give some tips on how to get your name into the initial conversations to be considered in the project. Then it's going to be getting new and repeat clients, a note about getting or working with an agent. Very controversial topic, I know. Only if you want to. And lastly, it's going to be finding your right price, because I know that's also like one of these convoluted topics that I think people are looking for. So just to get started, right, how'd you get your gig? So we always see creatives sharing those big name celebratory projects, but how they obtained those projects and how they got their names into the hat in the first place is usually a mystery. So my goal today is to kind of demystify the process of booking and executing commercial illustration projects by walking through some of my personal journeys and methodologies. So here's how I went from doodling on coffee cups on the subway for a few years to illustrating campaigns for Fortune companies. So again, my name is Loe. I'm an art director and illustrator in New York City. I'm represented by Gerald and Colin Rapp, or Rap Art, and I have 2 big dogs in my tiny New York City apartment. So just to go over some work, so I've done things like digital advertising. Sorry, no reels, so I have to click through them. I've also worked on TV stuff. I worked on digital campaigning. This was for Google for AIPI month. I've done some out-of-home or OOH, and this is the not-so-glamorous New York City subway, but it was a subway takeover. I've done some merch collections, so on this side it was with UNIQLO, and on this side it was with the Democratic Party of the United States. And lastly, I have done some social media campaigns. This one was for the skincare line Limmer. So where did I start from? So starting from square one, or almost like square zero, because I grew up first gen in a really immigrant-heavy community, and so I didn't even know that a creative industry existed. I would say my community and my family, they wanted me to be like a doctor or an engineer or something really stable, because when they came here, they had to start from the very beginning. So it wasn't until high school that I discovered design, or in my eyes, design was like Photoshop. Like I learned Photoshop, and I secretly applied, and I got a scholarship to Parsons School of Design, and I majored in branding and advertising because I convinced my parents that was like a business degree. And then so after I graduated, I worked as a junior designer at a media company, and I wasn't making enough to actually live in New York City, so I went to Jersey, and I had like a 1.5-hour, 2-hour commute to work every day. So during that time, I started sketching on like my morning coffee cup that I was drinking in the morning, and also some sketchbooks. So these are some examples of the things that I had that I was drawing on the way to work. And it's actually from like 5 years ago, so you can see that my style has changed a lot. And just things can change a lot in just, a few years. So when I first started my job, I thought I'd be illustrating at my day job, but that was totally wrong. I did graphic design at my design job, surprise. But when I did do illustrations, it would be like, vector illustrations, sometimes iconography, but never in my own personal style. So that's when I kind of realized that, the design industry and the illustration industry, it's actually a little bit separate. Not totally separate, of course, but they each kind of have their own like organizations and structures and connections and also award system. So when I wanted to get more into the professional industry of illustration, I was kind of like, well, I never took any classes or anything, so, without any ties or like professors or mentors or any direct connections, like how do I get my foot into this like mysterious, like land of illustration? So these were some ways that I started to try to get into the illustration field. So first, I kind of started with the obvious. So I started building a body of work and just putting it on a website. So by body of work, this is kind of what I mean. So I was doing like $100 commissions, personal works and stuff for local businesses for a while. And I just put that on a website just to show people that I have something and, I can illustrate. And that was pretty much step one. 2, use social media, but you don't have to rely on it. I think one really amazing path, especially as we've seen, is kind of going viral and then getting commissions that way. That never happened for me. So I tried, but I did use social media to kind of do research and also connect with creatives online, and that was a really, really big help. And last but not least, really going into the point that I just made before, but that was when, when I used social media and I was kind of like stalking my favorite illustrators. And I was like, okay, what organizations are they from? Like, what kind of awards are they winning and what kind of reps do they have, right? And then I also, the community is so nice. I was like reaching out to these illustrators, kind of like as nobody. And then I asked them, I showed them some of my work. I got feedback. And eventually I was, confident enough to kind of reach out to clients directly or applying for an agent. Okay, so that was kind of like my baby steps into the illustration industry. So now I'm going to go through the case study of a recent project that I've done from very beginning to end. So this is a recent project I did with UNIQLO to launch a collection within their flagship stores, just for a little bit of background. So for me, the very first step of a project is always getting the inquiry. So you either get the inquiry from the client or from an agent, and they're going to gauge like your interest and if you have time for it, right? I would always assume that you're not the only candidate. That's, at least for me, that's like never the case, because now that I'm a little bit more on the other side, I will never only pick one candidate, because if they're busy, then I'm screwed, right, for the project. So always assume those two things. And then number 2 is kind of like interviewing for the job. So after you get informed of the inquiry and you're like, yeah, I can do this, I really want to do this, now you kind of have to interview for it. So that's like when you go, to the team and you tell them why you're such a good fit, your standard processes, and also kind of like some initial ideas. Not too much. You don't want to give them your ideas, but just like how you're going to work. And on the examples on the side, just to be like extremely transparent, can't get more transparent than this, but these are some screenshots of, when I got the inquiry and also feedback that I got from my first interview here for the collection. So on the top, the manager, she reached out to me on Instagram. That's not where she found me actually, and this never happened to me before, but she asked me if I was interested via Instagram message, and if I was, to send her an email. So that's what I did. And then on the bottom, that was feedback I got when I interviewed with the UNIQLO CEO, the USA one. And he said, he really, this is from his assistant, so he said he really enjoyed your artwork and would definitely consider me as a candidate. I didn't even get it yet. But before we do that, he wanted to understand more about like my philosophy on life, why I draw what I draw, what inspires me, and just make sure that like my ethos as an artist aligns with UNIQLO's ethos. So yeah, sometimes it actually does go that deep, but luckily I got the job. So after that, when you finally get the job, before I do any work at all, usually what I do is I like to ask a set of questions, and this really sets you up for success, and it also shows the client it's not your first rodeo, even if it is, right? So what things that I always ask for is like, do you guys have a brand style guideline? And if you do, like, how hard are we leaning into this brand guideline, right? Like, is it like 50% your branding and 50% my interpretation, or is it like mostly my interpretation? I always ask about that ratio just to get it out of the way. And then the second thing I always ask about is like mood board and visual inspiration, because obviously more information on what the client is envisioning in the beginning is always better. And then last is just like all the specs and technical stuff. So it's kind of like, what are the final number of deliverables? Like, what are the final formats? Like JPEG, PSD, and then also the sizes, right? Pixel and inches sizes of each format. And also if you're doing print, like maybe the color profile. Okay, and then next what I do, this is pretty much my process, like verbatim, that I prescribe for every client. But of course I always change it up a little bit in accordance to like their timelines and their structures. But this is basically it. So, first we go through the brief and the requirements. So we went through the brief together, and then we go through the requirements and the questions that I just asked in the beginning. And then we do concept sketches and one round of feedback notes that are consolidated. Then we do refined sketch, round 2 with minor feedback. And then we go into the full-on digital illustration, which is like all the color and the texture. And I'll write, I can include minor tweaks if needed. I always write if needed because I'm like, just a subtle little like, okay, if you really need this. And then finally, and the best part is always just like delivering everything in the final formats. And again, on the side, I have this like lengthy email that I always send to every client, but this is just full transparency, like what I usually do. So you could see at the top, I'm like, okay, this is information they didn't tell me yet, so I'm just going to ask about the size for each asset and also the color profile since we're printing on t-shirts. And then you'll see that I have this extremely lengthy email that I write. And sometimes people are like, do you actually write that big email to every single client you work with? And I'm like, yeah, actually I do. And the reason is I put a little bit more time into that. And that's because that's going to be for the 5th point that I have. And, because me writing out the process and getting the sign off on it, and we're all kind of like, okay, this is what we're doing at the very beginning. This kind of helps me gauge when to be flexible and like when to ask for more money. Because I know that's like a question people have when they're like, when should I be asking for more money? Like at this point, right? You kind of like feel it on the inside, but you're not really sure. So what I usually do is I use this really long outline that we wrote in the beginning together as a basis on when to ask for additional compensation. So when there's a lot of rounds going outside of this process, then you're like, okay, now you know that this is when you're going to ask for more money, right? And what I usually say is, I think when you go to clients and you tell them, hey, I'm going to charge more, they're going to be really upset in the beginning. So what I usually do is I send like an orange flag right before I do that. So what that means is I send this kind of like warning that's like, I'm about to charge you more. And it usually goes over a lot better. And what that really does, it's more along the lines of, verbatim, if this helps anyone. I usually write something like, hey, just a heads up, we are passing the estimated number of rounds. I can make these edits, but anything additional may need a relook at scope. So usually that goes over a lot easier, and it also forces people to kind of consolidate their feedback because they don't want to ask you again because they know for sure you're going to charge them more. But also it just sets your boundaries as like, professional artists. Okay. And yeah, so that was kind of my process from getting the inquiry to delivering final deliverables. But I think the big question is probably like, okay, well, how do I get my name in the initial conversations when like the CDs and ADs are considering artists for a project? Like, how do I get my name in the hat in the first place, right? And then I think just from at least my experience, the true reality is that there's really only so much control that you have. Like, there's so many factors, like, the fact that clients or the agencies are the one picking the final artist, so you can't do anything about that. A lot of it is also timing. But these are, a list, and it's going to be a lengthy list, of things I ask clients that I've worked with. I ask them, like, how did you find me? Like, where did you find my work? And this is a list of what I got from a lot of my clients. And so, and I think that these tips will help you increase your chances of getting discovered. And just for a note today, like, all the projects that I talk about today, none of them I got through social media. So these tips actually do work if that's not, you don't have to use it as your only outlet. So the first one is, don't underestimate the power of reaching out. So I know this one is the most work, and it's definitely one of those things that, you send like 50 messages, you only get one yes, but you only need one yes to start. So, what I usually do is I go on LinkedIn or Instagram, and I just kind of start emailing or messaging like art directors, like designers, and, business owners, and we kind of just start a conversation going. 2, and this one is more surprising that multiple people have mentioned this, but putting your illustration or your artwork in situ or in the mock-up, in addition to just publishing the illustration or your artwork by itself, helps a lot. And I was really surprised to learn this because almost every single commercial project I do, people ask me like, hey, but have you ever illustrated a blank before? Like, and that could be like a poster or like a t-shirt or a mug or a coaster. I mean, not a coaster, a coffee packaging. And I'm like, what is the difference between all these things? Like, what? Like, besides the specs, right? Like, how is this going to be any different? And I realized that now that I'm a little bit more on the other side, asking artists to be commissioned, I realize now it's because there's a lot of people that you'll be working with that's going to touch this project, and they are not creatives. So they literally cannot envision the final product without seeing it, like literally seeing it. So, and even if you are working with the creative, or you're working with the AD or the CD, they're going to have to share your work with people who are not creative, like account and stakeholders. And a lot of times they need that visual evidence to sell you through. Very complicated process, just to show that you have done it before. And the second reason I found that this is because now that, like I said, I'm a little bit more on the other side, designers and ADs have very crunched timelines sometimes to put these directions together. So if you have like a beautiful t-shirt artwork and you just put it on a t-shirt and then you put it online, on our side, if we're like, oh my God, this is beautiful and this is perfect, I'm just going to grab this and put it right on my mood board. I don't have to mock it up myself. That just ups your mood board chances, just making your artwork really easily grabbable. And I have like an example of this working on this side. So one of the earliest campaigns I've ever done was for Grubhub, and that was for a Subway takeover. And over they were like, okay, but have you ever done a Subway campaign? And I was like, yeah, but no. I was like, so they're like, yeah, can you send us some basically examples or evidence that you've done this, right? So at the time I was working at a company and they were thinking of doing Subway ads. They never did it. But I was like, well, I kind of already designed some, but they weren't ever done. But let me just mock it up on a Subway and send it to them and see if they believe it. And they did, actually. And they hired me. So yeah, fake it till you make it. Yeah, and the craziest part is it's not even illustration. They literally just wanted to see if I was like familiar with the medium. So you never know. That's why I always say mock up your work. And then the third point, I know this is a lengthy slide. The third point would be working with like your local organizations. So during the pandemic, Chinatown, which is where I'm from, was hit really, really hard. So I started working with this nonprofit called Welcome to Chinatown. And then we did a lot of stuff together. We raised money and we made like design collateral for like all the local businesses and restaurants. And we also did like mural workshops. It was really, really fun. And now, more recently, since they've gained some popularity, they actually threw my name to one of their sponsors, and that sponsor was Google. So because they got my name through there, Google actually commissioned me the next year for a really big digital campaign. So you really never know where anything is going to go, right? And then the next thing, which I have an example on the side, is just submitting your work to publications and also public display. So there was a time where I was like submitting my work to everything. I was like, creative boom, like it's nice that, like, like colossal. And I actually did get some articles and also commissions from those publications. One thing I also did is I submitted my work for like a public art display, which I think a lot of places is free to do so, but you just have to get chosen. I know it's all chance in that point. So that's why I say apply to everything. But when I got chosen, they displayed some of my personal artwork all over New York City, and this is Link NYC. They're like these digital billboard displays all over the city, and a lot of people use them as ports to like charge their phone. But this is actually where the manager from UNIQLO first saw my work. And then she went online to like find me. So you never really know. And then the next thing I'll go through really fast, but the next is like going through your own network. I think, of course, you guys know this is super important, but I also kind of caveat that like don't just connect with your fellow artists, because like 99% of the time, like illustrators are not going to hire you for illustration. So I would definitely also connect with like ADs, designers, copywriters, producers. That's also really important. And this just goes back to the fact like my Coca-Cola project, that was from an old project manager I worked with like years ago. And when they were doing this project at their agency, she just kind of threw my name in there. She didn't have, final say, but just the fact that she was able to suggest me, like, that was amazing. And then finally, 6, word of mouth really goes into what I just said. But a lot of my my current projects have sprung from my past projects. So I think that's why I put a lot of, work into like the process and client experience, because the community is pretty tight-knit and close. So it's actually easier to spread your name around than you think. And last but not least, share it online. And I think that's point's been made like a lot, here, and it really does work, when you share it online. A lot of times, like sometimes I'll put up artwork somewhere and I'm like, this is kind of weird and niche, and I don't know if it belongs on my Instagram, but I'll put it on there and I'll get like 10 views. But I've actually seen that same little weird piece on mood boards like twice. So I was like, oh, you really never know who's looking. Okay, so those are ways that I got my work discovered, but how do you convince clients to like go with you and also to keep coming back for more? So I remember I heard this phrase that was like, the livelihoods of restaurants are actually dependent on its regulars, and that's something that's really true for me. So, sorry about that. So what can you do? So for me, I always think like, okay, it's one thing to be like a really great artist. Like you could be super talented and like really, really unique. But if you're difficult to work with, that could actually dwarf your business. So I divided this into like 2 categories, and that would be soft skills and hard skills. So the soft skills is mostly like communication and presentation, and I've gone through a lot of them before. So it's like learn to pitch you and your own work well. Right, pretend it's like an interview, so do your research, like research the company, like their background, their ethos, and try to like preempt, come up with connections that you have with them going into talking to them. Next is just like prescribing your process and the right questions up front, because then this makes everyone's expectations aligned, and it also sets your boundaries so everyone knows, or has an idea of what you're going to do. And last but not least, and I know this is extra work, but I also have like a personal branded presentation template that I'm using right now. But the reason I do this is because usually when I make a deck for clients, right, I will put everything on it. So like I'll even like screenshot the brief if they send it an email, and I put it on there. And then I'll do like round 1 of sketches. Then I'll screenshot their feedback right next to it, and then round 2 sketches. And I kind of take them through this entire journey of what we've done together. And even though it's a little bit more work to create the template, it's easy once you already have it. I realized that this really prevents clients from changing their minds and going backwards, because I think they feel guilty that they've seen you do all this work and see all this feedback, and then you're like, ooh, like, okay, I don't know if I want to change my mind. And even if they do change their mind, which, everyone knows happens a lot, actually everyone, I've noticed after doing this, they're also like really apologetic about it. They're kind of like, oh my God, I know we've done this much work, but can we please just squeeze this in? So it just kind of makes the whole process more pleasant. And then last is like the hard skills. So from what I've seen, knowing some basic graphic design is actually a really huge plus when it comes to doing illustration work, and sometimes it's like a lifesaver. So what I mean is like a few simple things, just like knowing some standard specs and formats, like print's going to be like about 300 dpi if it's going to be up close. You're going to know that it's like 1080 by 1920 for like a social story, things like that, because clients not always going to tell you. But, if you're unsure, definitely just ask up front, because a lot of times every client and vendor is like different. They have different things that they want. And that really goes into the second point, which is just knowing some basic production for like templates, mechanicals, and storyboards. So I've been asked actually a couple of times to be involved in like the production process, especially for like that subway one. They were like, oh, but do you have like InDesign, like skills? And I had some. But basically, it wasn't anything crazy. It wasn't making the mechanicals. It was just like moving the elements around and scaling it, just to make sure that it's all composed correctly on the page. So even if it's the same artwork, but because some subway ads or some ads in general are like square, and some is just like really, really long. So they just want to make sure that you have the ability to kind of move your own stuff around before they put it to print. Third point would be mocking up copy and type, which I think is not too difficult, but a lot of times like artwork and copy go together in commercial projects, so it'll be like copy or a title. If you say that you can just kind of quickly mock it up together in Photoshop and show it to them, that's like I've seen that's been like a really huge plus, even if I just use their font and type it in. And sometimes when I'm like, oh, like I can customize your brand font a little bit or do like a little bit of hand lettering, that's also been a really good tool, like when I offer it, to get more money, actually. So that's been a really huge help as well. And last but not least, again, another really long slide, is just to make the formatting fit your own process. And this goes hand in hand with like all these things, especially knowing the specs. Because a lot of times for print, vendors are always like, yeah, I need an AI file, Illustrator file. And like disclaimer, like I've never given an Illustrator file because I don't draw in Illustrator. I draw in Photoshop or I draw in Procreate. I draw in pixels. So usually with this, but just because I know they don't truly need an AI file because I've printed billboards using photography and all this stuff, it kind of just opens up this conversation of like, okay, this is a billboard. Like, what is the minimum resolution that you really need for a PSD file? Like, what is the color profiling? Because we've done billboards that's like, only like 10 DPI, and it's okay because it's super far away. No one's going to go like put their face on it. So, just knowing that you can do that stuff and open that conversation helps fit the formatting to your process, and that just makes everything go a lot smoother. So the bottom line of that is just familiarizing yourself with the terminology and the technicalities, of design, which is usually just a step after illustration. Just makes the entire process and the team you're working with just go a lot more smoother, and it's also make your files more transferable. So the real bottom line is, the easier you are to work with, the more people want to come back to you. Okay, yay, controversial topic, which is a note about agents. So, I think a lot of people, especially if you're an artist, like you've seen in some of the other talks, when you start growing, one of the first big topics that people talk to you about is like getting an agent, right? And when I was first trying to get an agent, I was actually trying to get one. There was a misconception that I had that if you get an agent, you're like set for life. You're like, oh my God, I don't have to do anything. Like they're going to give me all the work and I'm just going to draw, right? Like I literally thought that was going to be me. But actually, now that I do have an agent, and I actually love my agent, these are some of the tips or the lessons that I've learned to help you decide if you want an agent, because it's totally up to you. But I think these are some things that not everybody knows, so it's good to kind of know this up front before you even decide you want one. So the first thing would be that it's a partnership. You can't just solely rely on your agent to get you work. They actually do a lot of other services as well. So they don't just do promotion, like they get you in the right directories. They do a lot of the legal contracting. They do a lot of the admin, and they attend the meetings for you in the beginning. And they also chase a lot of invoices for you. Because normally I work full time, I don't really have any time to do attend the initial meetings and do all these specs in the beginning. So they kind of take that workload off of me. So that's been really, really valuable. And then I think one of the professional illustrators I spoke to in the very beginning, they told me like, hey, when you get an agent, just like expect it to be like 50% of the work comes from yourself and 50% of the work comes from them. And that's actually really true for me now. So I always like put that ratio up front. The second thing that people should know is that there's fees, and I think probably everybody knows this, but a lot of the standard agencies that I've seen, like a lot of the big ones, the fees are usually 20 to 30% of your standard commission. So that's a big chunk. So it's something that you have to really decide if you want. And on top of that, there's also some yearly fees to be, sometimes published in certain publications like Communication Arts, Directory of Illustration, and like Workbook. And then lastly, I think this is one of those hidden nuanced things that once you are in an agency, then you kind of realize it. But if you're an agent that has a big roster, and mine has like, I think 150 artists, this could also mean that it's some added competition to getting work, right? Because, the client is going to go to like a lot of artists and a lot of reps. And so it's your rep's job to get the win for the agency. So when they get the project, it's not unlikely that they will list your name in like a list of like other artists who would be perfect for the project. So even though having the community of a big roster is honestly amazing, I also love my fellow rap art artists. Just know that you're not going to be the only name when you get suggested. It's going to be, your name with a lot of other artists who could also take that job. So the bottom line is I honestly really love my agent. It's because when I started working with them, like I said, I had those like really small personal works and like family gifts that we do in the beginning. And so they were really the ones to mentor me in this whole process. So, a lot of tips I kind of got from them here. But like I said, it's not for everybody. I think if you learn your own like business nuances and a lot of these contracting and logistical things, that allows you to operate on your own, and also you can keep all of the profit. And so that just leads into, this is the best meme, leads into like talking about money, right? So let's say you don't have an agent and you don't want one. I guess these are kind of like my tips that I almost kind of stole from them to help you find the right price for your projects. And I really do think that the right price comes down, honestly, to the individual. And it'll change as you get more experience, as you get older. But this is kind of the guidelines that I have to pricing my projects. So when I do these like one-time gigs, these one-offs, my price is actually project-based. It's not hourly or day rate-based, which I think a lot of people are kind of shocked when I tell them that. And I have a few reasons for doing that I've learned about doing that. But I think a big one is just that a lot of commercial projects have a set budget. Even when I go out to artists, like I have a budget in mind. So if you give like an hourly rate, it's kind of hard for anyone to track how many exact hours you're going to do. And so that kind of risks going over budget. And not to say that we're not going to go with you or, we're not going to go with that artist, but it does create a little bit of a barrier, just like that question mark. And the second is that I've actually really underestimated myself a lot in the beginning, thinking I'm going to charge like this of my hourly rate. My agent was like, slap my wrist. She's like, don't do that. Like, I'll do the talking. But I realized that I really underestimated myself, and I was shocked to find that some of the budgets are like literally 2 to 3 times bigger than what I suggested. And then last but not least, I changed the rate based on like the brand name. So like I'm not going to charge Google the same thing I'm going to charge my like local cafe. Because, Google's budget is like leagues higher than my local cafe. And of course I'm going to have a little bit of flexibility for a place I go all the time. I like the owners, things like that, right? And then the second factor to kind of helping decide the right price is like this classic duel that I know everybody is really familiar with, right? Which is like, what's your budget versus what's your rate? And you want to see like who capes first. But usually when this talk comes up, and of course it's like the first thing that clients always ask, I actually have this like script that I write, and I wrote it in case anyone is like interested. But yeah, I see some people taking photos, like please feel free to take photos. I usually write something along the lines of like, hey, I don't actually have a standard rate, and I prefer to be flexible per each client's wants and needs. Do you have a budget for the project? Even a ballpark range is very helpful. So I found that just like writing something that's like kind of polite and reasonable, I'm usually able to squeeze the budget out first, which is really useful because knowing the budget up front, of course, is going to help you decide even if you want this project, right? Because you're not going to do a whole advertising campaign for $500 and be like, okay, well, we spent 90 emails and you kind of wasted my time. So I always try to get the budget first. And some more factors that I use to determine project-based pricing. There's actually a lot of factors, but I'll try to go through them fast. So one is region. So it's like, is this going to be published just in the state, internationally, by country, the licensing terms. So are you going to use this artwork for like a year, 2 years, in perpetuity, aka forever? If it's in perpetuity, like I really hike up the price. The medium, so it's like digital, social media, print, OOH or out of home. Usually I do print and out of home like higher than digital. The name of the brand, of course. If client asks for you directly, so I started like realizing this as like time went on, but I noticed like my agent will be like, hey, like just wondering how many other candidates are there for this project? If like something along the lines of like, oh, well, we're just asking you right now, we're just asking Loe right now, but like if she's busy, then we'll ask the other artists. Okay, well, now it's time to really hike up the price because they know that they really want you. So that's another tip. I know, it's evil. But and then the last two things that I always consider, and that's why I always say it's kind of really down to you and like as you grow as well. But if the project has a lot of creative freedom, or if I just want to do it really, really badly and you're like, oh, this would be amazing on the book, I'm a little bit more flexible in pricing because, I can kind of do what I want and like I really, really want to work on it. So last but not least, I know like that was a lot of factors and a lot to think about, but I just wanted to put some ideas to put some actual numbers to the ideas because I know it can feel a little bit abstract. So these are some, I know this is literally me opening myself up to you guys. But this is my personal price sheet, and this is just some things that I've charged for in the past. And in the past, I've done like digital illustration series for like a social campaign for a Fortune 10 company. I gave them 2 years of licensing, and each illustration for that was $2,000. I also did a series of printed illustrated ads for a magazine for a pharmaceutical ad agency. Pharmaceutical usually has a lot of money, and and they actually wanted to own it. I was actually okay with that because the style of the illustration was actually black and white sketch. It actually goes back to what I did in the very beginning, in the very beginning slides you saw. So because it was like sketch style and it was going to be low lift, I actually charged them $6,000 for each illustration. And then last but not least, I did a 100-square-foot mural for one of my local cafes, and that included me drawing the design, getting all the materials, and also the physical labor of painting, and I only charged them $2,000. But, yeah, thank you so much.